My guest today is author Nicole Bell, who delivers a captivating and vulnerable account of her husband's journey with early-onset Alzheimer's disease in her book, What Lurks in the Woods. This book will inspire people who are suffering from chronic symptom-based illnesses to dig deeper so they can find and treat the root causes of their disease before it's too late. Welcome to Lifeology.
Well, thank you for having me.
I am looking forward to this. Unfortunately, we had to meet under these circumstances of what's happened in your life and in your family's life. And so first off, before we get started, I want to honor everything that happened and know that we as listeners, our heart goes out to you and your family. And we just truly want to, like I said, honor everything you've experienced.
Oh, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yes, of course. You are in the medical device field. You're an engineer by training as well. And so you are a brilliant woman. And so I think anytime things happen in people's lives, sometimes we're surprised that we have the skill set already within us or the background within us to be able to move beyond what circumstances or situations may say. And so because of what happened, and we'll get to that in just a second, what happened with your husband, you had the ability and the tenacity and the intelligence and everything to be able to talk with us today about people who have an illness that just can't be described. Can you walk us through what happened with your husband? Because I was reading about him. He sounds like an amazing person.
Yeah, I mean, he really was quite one of a kind. I mean, he was the smartest person that I ever met. He was uniquely hysterical in the way that he interacted and the jokes that he told. And we really had a fabulous relationship. I mean, we never argued. We were both engineers. And so we kind of just debated like facts in a weird way that we just figured out who had the better argument, and then we would really just make the most of it. But over time his mood started to change. He got irritable, he got depressed, he got angry and would have bouts of rage. And I attributed it to life factors. He had taken a step back from work. He had a very successful career as an electrical engineer, computer scientist, and kind of worked his way up to be an executive in startups and all sorts of new technologies. But he had taken a step back. It was kind of my time to shine. He was older than I was. And so he said, I'll step back and be Mr. Mom and kind of take care of the kids because we have 2 young children. Then that didn't seem to work. And I said, well, if you don't want to stay at home, then go back to work. But that didn't work either. And he was just irritable and started getting nasty, and to the point where I thought that we were headed for divorce, to be honest.
Oh gosh, wow.
But then, in 2016, I realized it was something deeper. He started having memory issues. The first sign that I remember was that he forgot the house code to the security system for our house alarm. And, then he started forgetting the time to pick up the kids and losing his keys and just all sorts of warning signs that he said were fine and were normal. But as I watched and I started to really notice, I realized he was starting to have some significant cognitive decline.
Wow. How old was he, if I may ask?
So at the time he was 59, 60 when he started having those issues. Yeah. So still very young,
really young
to be experiencing cognitive decline.
Exactly. Wow. Especially to be that sharp in all other areas of his life. It would be a huge flag of some sorts. But, once again, why would we think that? Because, it's everything just fine. I mean, who would ever think, oh, this is potential Alzheimer's? I mean, that's not a normal go-to thought process. So what happened with that? So you decided, okay, let's have some cognitive testing done, some testing done in general.
Yeah. So we first started and went to an integrative practitioner. So I'm a big believer in holistic medicine and really trying to look at all avenues of health. And so I didn't want to go to the traditional medical system where we only had 15 minutes. I knew that we needed to go deeper. And the first thought that I had when we went there was Lyme disease, because my husband was a hunter. He was constantly in the woods, and I had read a lot about how Lyme led to cognitive decline and brain fog, I think was really what I was fixated on at the time. And so we went to an integrative practitioner. And the other thing that I flagged for him was he had exposure to heavy metals. So because he was a
Oh, okay.
hunter and a big
Mm-hmm.
shooter, he had a lot of exposure to lead. He
Mm-hmm.
did a lot of
Mm-hmm.
reloading and a lot of shooting. And, if you
Mm-hmm.
read about lead, there's lots of nasty things that it can lead to,
Yes, of
particularly for
course.
your cognitive function. And so we went to the practitioner and we had him tested for Lyme disease with a standard Western blot, which is what the CDC recommends. And he tested negative.
Mm-hmm.
She ran a whole series of blood work and everything came back kind of quote unquote normal. And then she tested him for heavy metals and he was a little elevated, but it wasn't really alarming. And so
Okay.
she suggested that we go and see a neurologist. And that was where
Mm.
the cognitive testing and the cognitive assessment started. And the first time we sat down, I went to like a really detailed all day assessment, and he was performing a series of basic cognitive tests. I mean, keep in mind, this man was a computer engineer and he would do, complex lines of code and,
Yeah.
all
Wow.
sorts of very
Brilliant.
complex problems. But they put up like very basic pattern matching exercises, something that my 5-year-old son could do at the time. And
Mm-hmm.
he was completely flabbergasted. He couldn't figure it out. And I
Wow.
was in awe. I was completely in awe because I knew that he had a problem, but I had no idea that it was that bad.
The
He wasn't
severity of
working
it.
at the time. Yeah, he wasn't working. And so I had no idea that it had gotten that bad. And that was when they suggested we get some imaging done. And his PET scan revealed that he had late stage early onset Alzheimer's. And
Oh
the
my
late
gosh.
stage was another big baseball bat in the head, that it was just that advanced at the time.
I can't imagine the fear that must have been going through your life and your mind as you were seeing all this unfold, the rapid decline, and just as the quote facts showing you where he was. Can you walk me? Can you tell me about that? I mean, the emotional part of that, because my heart just breaks just hearing this. I can't imagine. I can't imagine how
Yeah.
it is for you and your family.
I mean, it was really just disbelief.
Surreal.
I couldn't get my head around the fact that he had Alzheimer's. I mean, every time I heard that word, my stomach would turn in knots, or
Mm-hmm.
just turn in loops. And I couldn't accept that that was going on. And so, and I'm an engineer, so I like to solve problems. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, so he has Alzheimer's. Everything that says that early onset Alzheimer's is usually linked to genetics. So we had him tested for every
Mm-hmm.
genetic marker
Mm-hmm.
that we could find, and they were all negative. So he had no predisposition, no family history. None of it made sense. So I kept looking
Doesn't make
for
sense.
other answers. Yeah, so I would, of course, do my Dr. Google research, right? And we'd look at all sorts of things that can lead to cognitive decline. And I had him tested for everything I could find. We tested his thyroid. I mean, I even tested for
Mm-hmm.
infections like HIV and syphilis. Talk
Mm-hmm.
about not
Mm-hmm.
knowing which
Yeah,
answer
of
you
course.
want, right?
Yeah, I know, right?
and
Exactly. Yeah.
and so but everything kept coming back negative. And I went to neurologist after neurologist after neurologist, and we couldn't find any answers. And so at that point, it was getting to the point where I was going to give up hope. And actually, one of the most horrible experiences where, that I dealt with was, we went to this neurologist who was the top neurologist in the area. Multiple people had sent us to him. He was the leading expert in dementia. And, I went in, I had 4 pages of notes. I had all of my
Mm-hmm.
information. I had a list of questions. I had all of our scans and his medical history. And, Russ left the room because he was so frustrated with all the cognitive tests. It can be very
For
demoralizing when
sure.
you can't
Straining. Mm-hmm.
perform. And so he stormed out of the room to go to the bathroom. And I literally begged the doctor. I'm like, doctor, I just don't understand why this is happening. He's so young. He's declining so quickly. He has no genetic predisposition. Like, all of my research says that this doesn't make sense. And he just looked at me and he was like, well, I'm sorry, Mrs. Bell, but sometimes, he used a swear word, which I won't use, but he said, expletive happens. And I was like, I just remember being crushed. I'm like, this is all of the years of medical school, all the years of training, and that's the best that you have to offer me.
Wow.
And, that and a prescription for either Namenda or Aricept, which, might help. And it was just really eye-opening to the plight of cognitive decline and Alzheimer's, is that there's really not a lot of answers out there.
Yeah.
And, but I was determined to figure it out. But at that point, I felt like I was losing hope.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. And I'm sure many of the practitioners who hear you say that this person used that phrase are probably turning, incredibly shocked by how disrespectful and how invalidating that is. And so I'm just incredibly, incredibly sorry about that. When you had your first hit or first hunch that it was Lyme disease, and they had the markers that were the evaluation that was done that the CDC suggests. Well, let me back up. How did you transition into say, well, wait a minute, there has to be something more? How did you know that it could be Lyme disease? How did you get to that realization?
So in the early stages, it was really just because of his history, and he had been bitten by a
Okay.
bunch of
Makes sense.
ticks
Okay.
and so forth. But then when he tested negative, we kind of went off the trail. But
Mm-hmm.
then later on, after I had that experience with neurology, several months later, my brother actually called me, and it turns out that his wife had been dealing out with her own health issues for years, and she had had multiple encounters with doctors and a long story that I won't go into. But at the end of the day, she ended up being diagnosed with Lyme and 3 co-infections. And my brother's
Oh
a
gosh.
doctor. And so
Mm.
he, started researching, and he called me and he said, Nick, I think that Lyme is what's causing Russ's problem as well. And of course, I'm like, well, that was my first thought too, just because he's always in the woods
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
I've pulled dozens of ticks off of him, and it
Yeah.
just makes more sense than Alzheimer's. But he tested negative. And, my brother talked to me and he explained to me that the standard test for Lyme is really grossly inadequate. Actually, now that I'm in the Lyme world, recent studies published in 2020 have shown that like 29% of people that have the characteristic rash, so they know that you have Lyme disease, only 29% of people test positive with the standard
Oh my
CDC
gosh.
2-tier test. So it's almost criminal
Wow.
that it's
That it
that
is only
inadequate.
28%. Oh
And
my gosh.
yeah, 29%. And there's a few reasons for that. I mean, there's lots of different types of bacteria. The Borrelia burgdorferi is the most common, but
Mm-hmm.
there's different versions of the bacteria that can also
Mm-hmm.
lead to symptoms. And
Yeah.
then
Like
also
was
it
it
tends to,
Babesiosa or something like that?
yeah, Babesia is a separate, that's a parasitic
Babesia.
infection that
Okay.
goes along
Okay.
with,
Gotcha. Okay.
with Lyme. And
Okay.
but Lyme, the bacteria tends to hide in tissues, and so it's not circulating. And then most importantly, it suppresses your immune system. When you have a chronic
Mm.
infection, your immune system is suppressed. And so the antibodies that the tests are looking for are not in abundance. And you have to have a
Makes
very
sense.
specific pattern of bands on this test of antibodies in order to test positive. So you're supposed to have 5. Russ had 1. So he showed some reaction, but not enough to flag the test. But later, my brother in this conversation, he said, well, don't have him tested for antibodies with the standard test. Go test him with PCR. So just like we used to test for
Mm.
COVID, right? You test for the
Mm-hmm.
actual bacteria itself, not for their immune system's response to the bacteria. And sure
Okay.
enough, when we tested him that way, he tested positive. And so he was flagged for Borrelia, which is what causes Lyme disease, and also Bartonella, which is another co-infection.
Yes, I've heard of that. I've worked with a lot of people and people I know in my life who've had Lyme disease, and so there's different ideas in the medical world, and some say it's nothing. Other ones are say no, this is something we really need to study. And so, unfortunately, you find different individuals who different schools of thought, if you will, and that's why I agree with you 100% when it comes to when we are the patient or someone there's something wrong. It's important to have a holistic approach in all areas. Always get as many opinions, professional opinions as possible, and do your own research as well, because there's always an answer. There has to be an answer. When you figure this out, unfortunately, it sounds like it was too late to help your husband.
Yeah, I mean, we still started treatment. I think at that point we
Mm-hmm.
were hopeful because, I
Mm-hmm.
think
Mm-hmm.
figuring out that you have Lyme disease and you have an infection seems a lot more manageable than Alzheimer's, which is really
Yeah, of course.
a death sentence,
Yeah.
frankly.
Mm-hmm.
There's not much that they offer you. And so we went to find, the top Lyme and Lyme literate physician that we could find in the area. And we
Mm-hmm.
started treatment, and he was really on a very integrative protocol. So he was on
Mm-hmm.
antibiotics, both
Mm-hmm.
oral and IV. He was on herbal supplements. He was on things that would help, detoxify and cleanse out his body, as well as a lot of immune modulators and trying to support his immune system. So he was on treatment for about 18 months. And I have to say, there were lots of periods where there was a lot of hope. I mean, I could
Mm-hmm.
definitely see the link between his mood and the infection. So as we treated, for example, one thing that really stunned me was Bartonella, because as we were on a protocol that really targeted the Bartonella infection, his mood would change. And as I
Mm.
researched
Oh
and
my
I
gosh.
started understanding that infection, Bartonella is really linked to that mood instability, the irritability, anxiety, a lot
Interesting.
of the things that I saw as early symptoms with him, but just chalked it off to life, the kids, the
Yeah.
family, the
Yeah.
pressures.
And of course you chalk it off. Of
Now,
course you do that.
yeah, and in hindsight, now I realize that those were early symptoms. Even the depression, that's absolutely a sign and a symptom of Bartonella. And so, as we treated, a lot of those things alleviated, and we were able to find supplements that really supported his brain chemistry, and we saw massive improvements in
Mm.
his physical, because he didn't present with joint pain, which I think a lot of people think of Lyme. They think of pain and
Mm-hmm.
joint pain. He didn't have any of that until his neurological progression was pretty advanced.
Declining. Okay.
But he did have it, and through treatment, he did start to get alleviated from all of that pain, and a lot of his cognitive mood instability went away. But over time, it was almost like trying to put out a forest fire, with
Mm.
buckets. Like I felt like we would make progress, and then he would fall backwards, and the cognitive decline continued to the point where I wasn't able to care for him. He was requiring full-time care. We had two young children at the time who were 5 and 8, and I ended up having to make the very difficult decision of putting him into a resident care facility, where he still
Oh
is
my gosh.
today. And yeah.
I'm so
So it's
sorry.
been
Is
a
there
very difficult journey.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Nicole. Is the prognosis, is it still where it currently is? Is it
He's
will it change at
continued to
all?
decline. He's continued to decline, and he's really in the final stages of the disease at this point. He's not communicating. He doesn't recognize me. I mean, there are lots of research that links the
Hmm.
bacteria associated with Lyme to Alzheimer's disease, and that as a
Sure.
potential cause. And so the phenotype and the reactions that he's having are very
Hmm.
typical for that disease. And
Yeah. So sorry to
it's
hear that.
to the point where, yeah, we've decided that it's just better to let him be at peace.
Well, I definitely honor your I honor everything that you've experienced, and I can't. I have no words for it, and it sounds trite for me to say anything, but thank you for sharing that with us. I think so many people can relate with loved ones that they have, and whatever stages of life they are. And I'm so glad to have someone like you be able to tell us and teach us this, as far as what we don't know. There's so much we don't know, but obviously there's so much that can be learned. But it is important to have the proper treatment team working with a patient. With the
Yeah.
people listening right now, what would be the biggest thing you would have them be aware of? So we talked about some of the symptoms. We talked about um, the irritability, the mood instability, rather, the rage, the forgetfulness. And there are many different markers that Lyme's has for people. You said perhaps even the joint and muscle pains. What would be some major things that people just aren't aware of, that you think would be additional things we could learn as we hear you talk about this?
Yeah, I think the link to the depression and mood was a huge one for me. I think so many of us chalk off signs and symptoms that we have, whether it's being a little bit fatigued, maybe it's being a little depressed, maybe it's a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of extra joint pain, these things. I mean, who doesn't have something that they complain about, right? I mean, we all have our,
Yeah,
our little idiosyncrasies that we
yeah, of
deal with.
course.
And I think that the thing that I've really come to appreciate is to listen to those symptoms and to try and understand. I mean, that doesn't mean that you
Mm-hmm.
panic at every little thing, but if a
Of
person has
course.
changed in a significant way from who they were. Like Russ had changed from who he was, but you kind of rationalize it away. That's really not something you should do. You need to listen. You need to pay attention to the signs and symptoms and dig. And sometimes, when you go to the doctor, you really have to push and you have to be
Yes,
your
you
own
do.
advocate. I mean,
Yeah.
I used to think of the doctor more as like this white knight that would come in and solve all of your
Yeah.
problems. And maybe that is, I realize now, I guess, how naive that is because, you spend 15 minutes with them every,
Hmm.
maybe once a month or less frequent. And how is it possible that they're going to figure out the small little things that
Yeah,
may
of
be
course.
going on with a very complex system? I mean, humans are
Hmm.
extremely complex mixture of genes and nutrition and all sorts of biochemistry that is very difficult to decipher. And so you really need to be much more in tune. And now when I work with doctors, I think of them more as an advisor where, I go in with
Hmm.
my list of questions, my list of symptoms, what are my things that I'm concerned about? What do I want to test? And sometimes you need to push in the test. I mean, I think that
Hmm. You do.
if you're a person that has been exposed to ticks and that you've been tested and you've tested negative, you really ought to press on that. I think that's something that I've really gotten my eyes open to is to how much that going to a facility or a laboratory that really specialize in tick-borne illness testing is important because what's out there and what's recommended is really quite antiquated
Subpar.
and insufficient.
Hmm. Yes. And so you were saying as far as the PCR, so to have, if anyone has been tested for Lyme disease and it comes back as negative, as you said, 29% of people, or only 29% of people are test positive for it. So you were saying to have them test for the PCR instead. And so that's something that they could ask their doctor about. They could push for that a little bit further to see if
Yeah.
if they really were exposed to that.
Yep, and I think sample collection type matters too. So one thing that is good, especially for Lyme disease, not as much for some of the other co-infections, but it tends to congregate in the bladder. And so urine tends
Mm,
to actually be a better sample for Lyme disease testing than blood can be.
interesting.
So, it's useful to
Mm,
really look at different sample types for different types of co-infections. And there's certain labs that are known, like IGeneX is really good for certain types of Lyme and Borrelia and Babesia Babesia and Bartonella. Galaxy Diagnostics in North Carolina is really well known for Bartonella. There's a company in California called Vibrant America that does a really comprehensive panel which covers lots of different diseases. So there's ones that
wow.
are out there that a Lyme literate physician would utilize, which is much more
Okay.
amenable to early detection than the CDC standard method.
Wow. Wow, you've taught us so much, and all this can be found in What Lurks in the Woods, the book that you wrote. The book itself, so it's a memoir, so it goes through your own journey, your emotional journey, goes through every process as well. What do you want the biggest takeaway for people to have when they read this book?
I mean, it really is a personal journey. I mean, I think that
Mm-hmm.
I wrote it, I wanted it to be our story, and I wanted to show the harsh reality of, being a caregiver and going through and trying to navigate a medical minefield, and figure out what's going on with chronic illness. Because
Yeah.
unfortunately, Russ is not unique in, having a mysterious illness that you don't know what the root cause is. And the medical community sometimes doesn't help you figure it out. So
Mm-hmm.
I really just wanted to share our journey so that people felt that might be in a similar situation maybe feel like they're not alone. They
Yeah.
feel empowered to push on their doctors and on their community to try and figure out for those answers, and that they learn from our experience and maybe understand that the signs and symptoms that they see, are something that they should heed. And I'm hoping that, people read it, they connect with our story. I've had so much wonderful feedback. It just
Sure.
launched last month and people have connected with it and it really have helped them process and see things in their life. And, that helps other people because that's, creating a reason for all of this and sharing our story is really the most important thing.
Yes, and you've done a fantastic job. And once again, I'm so sorry that we had to meet under these circumstances, but I'm very blessed and honored to have you on my show, and also just to have your insights and everything you've learned to be able to teach us as well. Because I was talking to you in the pre-call about some people I know that I definitely want them to watch the show, purchase your book as well, so that you have these understandings of perhaps there's maybe a little bit more than what they've been told.
Yeah. Yes, I absolutely think there is, and I encourage people to dig.
Yes, thank you. Well, Nicole Bell, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on my show today. If my listeners want to find out more information about you and to purchase this book, one more time, What Lurks in the Woods, where will they find this information online?
So the book is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or really anywhere books are sold, at What Lurks in the Woods. And you can also find me on my website, www.nicoledaniellebell. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram at the same handle, Nicole Danielle Bell.
Excellent. Well, my listeners also know that if you cannot find this information any other place, simply go to the show notes at jamesmillerlifeology.com, and I will link you all with Nicole's information. Thank you so much for being a wonderful guest on my show today.
Thank you for having me today.